The UK ups its terror threat level as President Obama struggles to recover from admitting to having no strategy to deal with terrorists in Syria. This is Special Report. Good evening, I'm Brett Baer. Tonight, Great Britain's threat level stands at severe, meaning the possibility of a terrorist attack there is highly likely. The British Prime Minister made the announcement in a detailed briefing with reporters this morning. Meantime, President Obama and his team are trying to rebound tonight from yesterday's declaration that there is no strategy to deal with the ISIS terror threat in Syria. His chief spokesman immediately tried to clarify that comment, and since then, the suggestion is that the president's military advisors may be to blame. We have Fox team coverage tonight. Catherine Herridge has frightening details of new documents detailing preparations for a biological terror attack found on a laptop at an ISIS hideout in Syria. Doug McKelway with the emerging rift between the Oval Office and the E-ring at the Pentagon. But we begin with Chief White House correspondent Ed Henry on the strategy of dealing with the no strategy admission. Good evening, Ed.
Good evening, Brett. Remember, it was Prime Minister Cameron who cut short his own vacation after the beheading of James Foley. Today, the president left his aides behind to deal with clarifying his comments about this crisis while he hit the road for some fundraisers. A tale of two leaders, one day after President Obama admitted he has no strategy to deal with ISIS in Syria. Prime Minister David Cameron revealed the UK has raised its terror threat level to severe and vowed to challenge radical Islam head-on.
This is not some foreign conflict thousands of miles from home that we can hope to ignore.
That came as White House aides said the Department of Homeland Security has no plans so far to raise the threat level here, and officials tried to dig out of the fallout from the president's news conference.
But I don't want to put the cart before the horse. We don't have a strategy yet.
Leading critics to charge the president is vastly underestimating the threat.
Cameron stands up there resolute. He's telling the British people what they're facing, what they're going to have to do, and our president is still trying to figure out what we're going to do.
White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest spent 24 hours trying to clean that up, in part by claiming it was the media's fault.
The reaction that we had at the White House yesterday was not in response to the president's comments. It's in response to the way it was being reported.
Except it was the president who promised 1 year ago this month he was putting together a strategy to deal with emerging terror groups like ISIS.
That requires us then to make sure that we have a strategy that is strengthening those partners so that they've got their own capacity to deal with what are potentially manageable regional threats.
Now, ISIS is a threat beyond the Mideast that some of the president's own cabinet secretaries have warned could be dangerous to the homeland.
1 year later, how can he not have that strategy?
Ed, as we've talked about quite a bit, the president has been very explicit about what the comprehensive strategy is.
White House officials explain the president is justifiably cautious about getting involved in Syria's 3-year-old civil war, while being aggressive about a military strategy in Iraq, where there have now been 110 U.S. airstrikes aimed at ISIS, which the Pentagon revealed is costing $7.5 million a day. Today, though, the president was fundraising in New York and Rhode Island.
Why is he still raising campaign money, playing golf, when he's acknowledging he doesn't have a strategy to deal with this?
Well, Ed, the job of any U.S. president is to be able to handle a lot of different responsibilities at the same time.
Now, at one of those fundraisers today, the president said, if you watch the nightly news, it feels like the world is falling apart. He tried to reassure the campaign donors by saying the world has always been messy, but we're, quote, just noticing now in part because of social media. We should remember, though, it was only a short time ago that Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel said the world is exploding all over. Brett?
Okay, Ed Henry live on the North Lawn. Ed, thank you. Even in the best of times, the relationship between the military and the executive branch can be testy. Right now, a president who just admitted having no strategy for ISIS in Syria seems to be looking for someone to blame. Correspondent Doug McKelway has that part of the story tonight. Good evening, Doug.
Evening, Brett. 8 days ago, Secretary of Defense Hagel called ISIS a sophisticated terrorist threat as we have ever seen. Asked if ISIS can be defeated without addressing Syria, Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Dempsey said no. The comments implied a U.S. military eager to get the job of destroying ISIS done. But both President Obama yesterday and Press Secretary Josh Earnest today seemed to suggest that attack plans were not ready.
Folks are getting a little further ahead of where we're at than we currently are. And I think that's not just my assessment, but the assessment of our military as well.
The president hasn't yet laid out a specific plan for military action in Syria. And the reason for that is simply that the Pentagon is still developing that plan, and he's still reviewing them.
The White House messaging stood in sharp contrast to what the Pentagon was saying today.
I think that anybody who has any knowledge of the United States military knows that we're ready. We're ready all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean that the planning process is complete or that decisions to do anything have been made. But that we are ready shouldn't be in doubt by nobody. Nobody. Our friends, our enemies, our potential adversaries.
Kirby later attempted to reconcile the apparent divergent messages by saying the president was referring to the potential for military options inside Syria. If it all suggests deep resistance to an attack in Syria, one military analyst says it's coming from just one man.
The Pentagon has, I can promise you, presented options to date, numerous options. But the president is reluctant to commit to anything. You can't have a strategy without a commitment.
Admiral Kirby added that in regards to an attack in Syria, quote, when we as a government are ready to have that discussion, we'll have that discussion. Brett?
All right, Doug, thank you. Whether a real threat or pie-in-the-sky hopes of ISIS, this next story is an illustration of just what ISIS terrorists have in mind for you, your family, and this country. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge is here with chilling specifics. Good evening, Catherine.
Well, thank you, Brett. According to the data files reviewed by reporters for Foreign Policy magazine, the owner of the laptop computer, an ISIS recruit from Tunisia with a background in chemistry, was teaching himself about biological weapons. Among the more than 35,000 files, a 19-page document about how to develop biological weapons and how to weaponize bubonic plague from infected animals. It also contained a 26-page Islamic ruling known as a fatwa from a well-known Saudi jihadi cleric on the justification for using chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons, also known as WMD. Quote, if Muslims cannot defeat the unbelievers in a different way, it is permissible to use weapons of mass destruction, even if it kills all of them and wipes them and their descendants off the face of the earth. Before publishing the investigative piece, a senior writer at Foreign Policy said they talked with intelligence officials and experts.
People are characterizing it as probably the most detailed look that we've seen so far into ISIS's capabilities and their ambitions.
While bin Laden's al-Qaeda experimented with biological weapons before 9/11, the terror network never mastered the use of WMD. A former CIA officer with the agency's WMD unit says it's not a coincidence that ISIS offered to swap American journalist James Foley for the release of a well-known Pakistani scientist held in a Texas jail. Afia Siddiqui is serving an 86-year prison sentence on terrorism charges. Siddiqui, a neuroscientist by training, went to MIT and Brandeis University. And during her 2008 arrest in Afghanistan, plans were found for a mass casualty attack.
The fact that they want Siddiqui back, who was up to her eyeballs in al-Qaeda WMD programs when she was captured, shows that this is a big deal to them.
While there's no evidence of an existing WMD program or systematic push to create one, it's an issue the intelligence community is watching closely, Brett.
Catherine, thank you.
You're welcome.
Now to Ukraine. Pro-Russian separatists are said to be firmly in control of the strategic Ukrainian coastal town of Novozovsk tonight. And despite Russian denials, Russian troops are also on the move inside Ukraine. And now Russian President Vladimir Putin is warning the U.S. and its allies to stay out of his way. National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin has that story from the Pentagon tonight.
Video from the front lines of the fighting inside Ukraine shows not only Russian tanks hidden amidst alleged aid convoys into Ukraine from Russia, but also captured Russian troops, whom Russian defense officials say merely got lost while on holiday. Russian President Vladimir Putin addressed a group of Russian youth at a Kremlin-backed summer camp, issuing the following warning to the West.
It's better not to mess with us.
He went on to remind the world that Russia is, quote, one of the leading invading nuclear powers, a veiled threat from the Russian leader to NATO, whose 28 members will weigh what, if any, further action can be taken to punish Russia for invading Ukraine, a word the administration refuses to use to describe Russian actions.
Whatever verb you want to put on it, whatever you want to call it, it's just, again, an intensification of the same behavior that we've been seeing Russia do now for several months.
Ukraine, meantime, is asking NATO to join its ranks and become a formal member, which would oblige the U.S. and others to defend it militarily from Russia's actions, a move likely to be rebuffed at the NATO summit that President Obama is slated to attend next week in Wales, despite strong words from NATO's Secretary General today.
Despite Moscow's hollow denials, it is now clear that Russian troops and equipment have illegally crossed the border into eastern and southeastern Ukraine.
Moscow sees it differently and has ensured that Russia's state-controlled media reports on the so-called separatists as victims of Ukraine's troops.
You know, even though it is very sad, it reminds me of the events of World War II, when Nazi German occupiers, fascist German troops, laid siege to our cities, for instance, Leningrad.
This as his foreign minister laughed off the satellite photos released by NATO yesterday, which show Russian artillery inside Ukraine, suggesting they were fake, perhaps part of a video game.
There have been reports that there are photographs from space showing movements of Russian troops, but as it turned out, it was computer games and the images were taken from there, and the latest allegations are more or less of the same kind.
Earlier today, Poland turned back a plane carrying Russia's defense minister. Tonight, another town on the way to the strategic port of Mariupol fell to Russian-backed fighters, putting Putin one step closer to his apparent goal of creating a land corridor from Russia to Crimea. Brett.
Jennifer Griffin live at the Pentagon. Jennifer, thank you. Up next, where are the huge numbers of children brought to the U.S. illegally going to go to school in coming days? First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates across the country are covering tonight. Fox 32 in Chicago, where a rush hour bus crash near O'Hare Airport left at least 13 people injured this morning. It also left air travelers on foot rushing to the terminal to catch their flights. Fox 5 in Atlanta, where NASCAR driver Tony Stewart will compete this weekend. It will be Stewart's first race since he struck and killed a young driver at a dirt track in upstate New York. And this is a live look at Los Angeles from Fox 11, our affiliate there. The big story there tonight, an elderly couple died in an apartment fire in Encino. More than 100 firefighters worked last night to put out that blaze. 5 civilians and 1 firefighter were taken to the hospital with injuries. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back.